The baby's screams echoed through the marble corridors of the penthouse, the most expensive real estate in Manhattan, owned by the most feared man in finance. Kesha's hands trembled as she tried to quiet her daughter, knowing that disturbing Alexander Harrington could cost her everything. Then she heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, and her blood turned to ice. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. The penthouse was silent at 11 p.m., just the way Alexander Harrington liked it. 53 floors above Manhattan, insulated by bulletproof glass and the kind of wealth that could buy entire city blocks, the sprawling residence existed in a perpetual state of controlled perfection. Every surface gleamed. Every shadow fell exactly where it should. Every sound was measured, deliberate, approved. Until tonight. Kesha Williams moved through the darkness of the East Wing like a ghost, her cleaning cart's wheels wrapped in felt to eliminate even the whisper of movement. She'd been working this shift for 3 months, midnight to 6 a.m., 5 days a week, and had mastered the art of invisibility. The pay was triple what other cleaning services offered, but the requirements were absolute. No noise, no mistakes, no evidence she'd ever been there beyond the immaculate results. She'd never even seen Alexander Harrington in person. The billionaire kept to his private office during her shifts, a sealed sanctuary at the penthouse's heart, where he conducted the late-night business that had made him the most feared corporate raider in America. At 38, he'd built an empire by identifying weakness and exploiting it without mercy. Companies trembled when his investment firm took an interest. Rivals disappeared into bankruptcy. Partners became casualties. They called him the Iceman because no one had ever seen him sweat, smile, or show a single flicker of human emotion during a negotiation. Kesha had no desire to meet him. She just needed the money. The apartment manager had been explicit during her hearing. Mr. Harrington values discretion and silence above all else. You will arrive through the service entrance at midnight exactly. You will complete your duties without disturbing anything beyond cleaning. You will leave by 6 a.m. You will never, under any circumstances, enter his office or make your presence known. Violation of any of these rules will result in immediate termination and forfeiture of all pay owed. Kesha had nodded, grateful for any job that could keep her and Elise fed. 3 months later, she'd become one of the rare employees Alexander kept long-term, which meant exactly nothing except that she'd successfully remained beneath his notice. Until tonight. She'd known bringing Elise was insane. Reckless. The kind of desperate decision you make at 11:47 p.m. when your babysitter texts that she's done with this shit and blocks your number, and you have exactly 13 minutes to get to work or lose the only job keeping you one step ahead of eviction. "Please, baby," Kesha whispered, rocking Elise against her chest as she navigated toward the guest bathroom she was supposed to be sanitizing. "Just a few more hours. Just be quiet for Mama, please." Elise had been fussy all evening, running a low fever that Kesha couldn't afford to have checked. At 11 months old, she was usually a good baby. Alert brown eyes, easy smiles, the kind of temperament that made Kesha believe maybe she was doing something right as a mother despite everything else falling apart. But tonight, Elise was uncomfortable and confused, and the strange environment of the penthouse was making it worse. Kesha had fashioned a makeshift bed in the corner of the housekeeping closet, towels arranged into a soft nest where Elise could sleep while she worked. It had worked for the first hour. Then the fever had spiked. Now Elise was crying. Not fussing, not whimpering, full-throated, escalating cries that echoed off the marble floors and vaulted ceilings like an alarm system. "SHHH, baby, please," Kesha bounced desperately, her heart hammering. She was in the residential wing's main hallway, exposed, 50 feet from the nearest closet where she could hide. The sound was bouncing everywhere, impossible to contain. She needed to run, needed to grab her things and get out before. The footsteps were so quiet she almost missed them. Almost. Kesha's entire body froze as she heard the distinctive sound of expensive leather shoes on marble approaching from the direction of Alexander's office. Slow, measured, deliberate. the footsteps of a predator who'd already spotted his prey. Elise continued crying, oblivious to the disaster she'd created, her small fists batting at Kesha's chest. The footsteps stopped. Kesha turned slowly, her arms instinctively tightening around her daughter. Alexander Harrington stood 15 feet away, backlit by the low lighting of the hallway that led to his office. He was taller than she'd expected from the rare photos she'd seen in business magazines, at least 6'3", with the kind of presence that made the massive hallway feel suddenly claustrophobic. Dark hair shot through with distinguished silver at the temples, a face that could have been carved from granite, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes so pale blue they looked almost colorless in the dim light. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, no tie, dark slacks that probably cost more than Kesha's monthly rent. Everything about him radiated controlled power and barely restrained irritation. Those pale eyes moved from Kesha to the crying baby in her arms, then back to Kesha's face. He said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by Elise's escalating cries. Kesha's mind raced through explanations, apologies, pleas, all of them inadequate. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice barely audible over Elise's crying. "My babysitter, she didn't. I had no one to. You brought a child into my home." His voice was exactly what she'd expected, deep, cold, precise. Each word measured and delivered with the emotional inflection of a corporate termination notice. "I know, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. I'll leave right now." "You violated the most fundamental term of your employment." "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll just..." "Stop talking." Kesha's mouth snapped shut. Elise's cries had reached a pitch that sounded almost painful, her small face red and streaked with tears. Alexander stood motionless for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something Kesha would have bet her life savings he'd never do. He stepped closer. "How old?" The question was clipped businesslike. 11 months, sir." "Fever?" "I think so. I'm sorry I couldn't." "I asked a question. I didn't request your life story." He was close enough now that Kesha could see the fine details of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he was older than his publicity photos implied, the absolute absence of warmth in his expression. Yes, she has a fever." Alexander's gaze moved to Elise, who was now almost purple with the effort of crying, her small body rigid with distress. Something flickered across his face, too fast for Kesha to identify. "Let me see her." The words didn't compute. Kesha stared at him, certain she'd misheard over Elise's screaming. "I don't repeat myself, Ms. Williams." He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. Alexander Harrington probably knew everything about everyone who entered his space: social security numbers, credit scores, criminal histories, shoe sizes. "She's..." "You have 3 seconds to comply before I call security and have you both removed." He held out his hands, and Kesha noticed for the first time that they were large, scarred across the knuckles in ways that didn't match his corporate image. Kesha's arms moved before her brain could fully process the insanity of what was happening. She shifted Elise toward him, half expecting him to recoil, to reveal this was some kind of test she just failed spectacularly. Instead, Alexander Harrington took her daughter with surprising confidence, adjusting his grip with the practiced ease of someone who'd held bobbies before. His large hands looked absurdly gentle as they supported Elise's small body, one under her bottom, one behind her back. And then something impossible happened. Elise stopped crying. Not gradually, not with the slow wind down of a child being comforted. She stopped mid-breath, her mouth still open, tears still wet on her cheeks. Her wide brown eyes locked onto Alexander's pale blue ones. And for a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply stared at each other. Then Elise reached up one small hand and placed it flat against Alexander's cheek. Kesha watched, her own breath caught in her throat, as the most ruthless billionaire in New York stood frozen in his hallway, a tiny brown hand resting against his pale skin like a benediction. "Duh," Elise said clearly, her voice rough from crying but unmistakable. It wasn't her first word. She'd said "mama" weeks ago, but it was the first time she'd ever said anything to a stranger, and the last thing Kesha expected to hear directed at Alexander Harrington. Something changed in his face. Not softening, that would be too generous, but a crack appeared in the ice, subtle enough that someone who didn't know what to look for might have missed it entirely. "What's her name?" His voice had dropped lower, quieter. Elise Marie Williams." "Elise," he said at once, testing it. The baby's eyes never left his face. Her small hand remained pressed to his cheek, and impossibly, miraculously, she smiled. Alexander looked down at her with an expression Kesha couldn't read, something between confusion and recognition, as if he was seeing something in Elise that he'd forgotten could exist. Then, still holding the baby, he turned and walked back toward his office. "Sir, Mr. Harrington," Kesha hurried after him, panic flooding back. "Where are you? What are you?" He stopped at the doorway to his private office, the sealed sanctuary she was never supposed to enter, and looked back at her with those cold, pale eyes. "You're fired from the cleaning service, effective immediately." Kesha's world collapsed. No job, no money, no way to pay rent or buy formula or... "You'll start as my personal assistant tomorrow. Salary is $200,000 annually, plus housing in the guest wing, health insurance for both of you, and childcare stipend. Standard employment contract, NDA requirements, absolute discretion mandatory. I'll have the papers drawn up by morning." He said it the way someone might discuss quarterly earnings. Factual, emotionless, already decided. "I what?" Kesha's mind couldn't process the words. "I don't understand." "Your daughter requires medical attention. I'm calling my personal physician. You'll bring whatever belongings you have to the guest wing tonight. Someone will collect the rest from your current residence tomorrow." "But I'm not qualified to be." "I decide what qualifications I require, Ms. Williams, not you." Elise had laid her head against his shoulder, her small body relaxed in a way Kesha had been trying to achieve for hours. "Do you accept the position, or should I call security?" It was insane. Impossible. The kind of fairy tale that didn't happen to broke single mothers who made desperate mistakes. But Kesha looked at her daughter, peaceful for the first time all night in the arms of a man who shouldn't have been capable of providing comfort, and heard herself say, "I accept." Alexander nodded once, the gesture sharp and dismissive. "Then we're done here. Dr. Morrison will arrive within 30 minutes. Until then, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the guest wing, third door on the left." He disappeared into his office with Elise still in his arms, and Kesha was left standing in the hallway of a billionaire's penthouse, her life completely transformed by a baby's cry and an ice-cold man's inexplicable mercy. She had no idea that mercy wasn't the right word at all. The guest wing of Alexander Harrington's penthouse was larger than any apartment Kesha had ever lived in. 2 bedrooms, each with en-suite bathrooms, a living area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline, a kitchenette stocked with brands she'd only seen in magazines, furniture that looked like it belonged in museums, everything in shades of cream and gray, expensive and impersonal. Kesha stood in the middle of the main room at 1 a.m., holding a sleeping Elise, returned to her 45 minutes ago by Dr. Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who'd examined the baby with brisk efficiency, prescribed antibiotics for an ear infection, and departed without asking a single personal question. The medications were already in the apartment's bathroom, along with a pediatric thermometer, infant Tylenol, and a handwritten care schedule in Dr. Morrison's precise script. Kesha had no memory of any of it being delivered. This was Alexander Harrington's world, one where problems were solved before you finished identifying them, where money moved invisibly to make reality conform to requirements, where the impossible became mundane through sheer force of resources and will. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt like she'd stepped into a trap she didn't yet understand. The employment contract had arrived at 6 a.m., delivered by a lawyer who'd waited patiently while Kesha read through 47 pages of dense legal language. The salary was real. The benefits were extraordinary. The NDAs were extensive and terrifying. Violation could result in legal action aggressive enough to ensure she'd never work anywhere again. She'd signed anyway. What choice did she have? By noon, movers had arrived at her studio apartment. How they'd gotten her address, she didn't ask, and packed her meager belongings with assembly line efficiency. By 2 p.m., everything she owned was arranged in the guest wing's smaller bedroom, looking pathetic and out of place against the expensive minimalism. By 3 p.m., she was standing outside Alexander's office, dressed in the most professional clothes she owned, black slacks, and a white blouse that suddenly felt shabby in this environment, waiting for instructions on what a personal assistant to a billionaire actually did. The door opened exactly at 3 p.m. Alexander stood in the doorway, dressed in a different suit, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, making him look even more imposing than he had the night before. In daylight, she could see more details. The hardness in his expression that seemed carved into place, the coiled tension in his shoulders, the way his pale eyes swept over her in assessment that felt clinical rather than personal. "You're on time," he said it like it was unexpected. "Come in." The office was massive, dominated by a desk that looked like it could double as an aircraft carrier deck. Multiple monitors displayed streams of financial data, news feeds, market analytics. The walls were lined with books, not decorative leather spines, but actual worn volumes that had clearly been read. Economics, philosophy, military history, biographies of conquerors and tyrants. No photos, no personal items, nothing that suggested Alexander Harrington had a life beyond acquiring power and wealth. "Sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, then remained standing himself. "Your primary function is to manage my schedule, screen communications, and coordinate logistics for meetings and travel. You'll also handle personal matters that require discretion, gifts, reservations, property management. You'll work from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. daily, with flexibility required for urgent situations." He spoke without pause, without checking if she was following. "You'll have access to my calendar, email, and contact database. Passwords and protocols are in this folder." He slid a leather portfolio across the desk. "Learn them today. Questions are acceptable during the first week. After that, I expect competence." Kesha nodded, her head spinning. This was so far beyond her experience. "I don't tolerate incompetence, but I do tolerate learning curves. The difference is effort." His eyes locked onto hers. "If you're trying and failing, I'll give you resources. If you're lazy or careless, I'll replace you. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Alexander, not sir, not Mr. Harrington. When it's just us, you use my name." The informality felt more unsettling than formality would have. "Yes, Alexander." He nodded sharply. "Where's Elise?" The question caught her off guard. "In the apartment, she's napping. I have the monitor." She touched the device clipped to her waistband. "Bring her to the office during work hours. I'll have a playpen installed." Kesha stared at him. "You want me to bring a baby into your office?" "I said what I said, Ms. Williams. Do you have a hearing problem?" "No, billionaires don't usually want bobbies in their workspace." Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement but close. "I'm not billionaires, I'm me, and I've decided this is how it will be. If that's a problem, you're welcome to leave." It wasn't a problem, it was surreal, but Kesha found herself nodding. "No problem, I'll bring her tomorrow." "Good, now sit down and start reading. You have work to do." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of learning curves and impossible adjustments. Kesha discovered that being Alexander's personal assistant meant managing an empire disguised as a schedule. Every meeting was a chess game. Every phone call contained layers of strategy she was only beginning to understand. Every email required decoding, reading between lines for threats, opportunities, alliances forming and dissolving. Alexander was exacting but not cruel. When she made mistakes, and she made dozens those first weeks, he'd explain exactly what went wrong and how to fix it. Once, if she made the same mistake twice, his expression would go cold in a way that made her scramble to ensure there wasn't a third time. But he never yelled, never berated, just went very, very quiet, and that quiet was somehow more terrifying than any anger could have been. He was also, she discovered, oddly patient with Elise. The playpen arrived the next day, not some cheap portable thing but a custom-designed enclosure with soft mats, educational toys, and enough space for Elise to crawl and play. It was positioned where Alexander could see it from his desk, and Kesha quickly noticed a pattern. When he was on difficult calls, negotiations that could make or break companies, conversations with competitors he was systematically destroying, his eyes would occasionally flick to Elise. Just for a second. Just long enough to watch her stack blocks or chew on a teething ring, oblivious to the corporate warfare happening 6 feet away. And his voice, which could cut through steel when addressing business contacts, would drop a fraction, soften imperceptibly. It was like watching someone remember how to be human for 3-second intervals. The stranger thing was how Elise responded to him. She'd smile when he entered the room, huge, delighted grins that she didn't give strangers. If she got fussy, she'd reach toward him, and Alexander would pick her up without comment, holding her against his shoulder while he continued working one-handed, typing emails with Elise's small hand fisted in his shirt. Kesha had asked about it once, 2 weeks in, while watching him absently pat Elise's back during a video conference where he was calmly explaining to a CEO why their company was about to be absorbed into his portfolio. "Do you have children? Is that why you're comfortable with her?" The video conference had ended. Alexander had set Elise back in her playpen with surprising gentleness before answering. "No," the single word was flat final. "Have you spent time around Bobbies before?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I had a sister. She died when I was 19. She was 3. The information landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through Kesha's understanding. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was 20 years ago." He turned back to his monitors, the conversation clearly over, but Kesha had seen something in his face before he'd turned away, a flash of old pain, buried but not healed. It explained nothing and everything. By week 4, Kesha had started to notice the patterns beneath Alexander's surface. He worked 18-hour days, slept maybe 4 hours a night, ate irregularly and usually without tasting the food. His apartment was spotless because he barely touched anything, a place to exist rather than live. He had no friends that she could identify, only associates and subordinates. His phone contained exactly 3 personal contacts: his lawyer, his doctor, and now Kesha. He was, she realized, profoundly alone. And then Elise had arrived in his life like a small, stubborn miracle, refusing to understand that Alexander Harrington wasn't supposed to be capable of softness. One night during week 6, Kesha was working late. Alexander had a meeting in Tokyo at midnight EST, and she needed to prepare briefing materials. Elise was asleep in her playpen, bundled in blankets. The meeting was brutal. Kesha listened from her desk as Alexander systematically dismantled the arguments of 3 executives who thought they could outmaneuver him. His voice was ice. His logic was merciless. When it ended, 2 of the executives had resigned on the call, and the third was agreeing to terms that would effectively hand control of their company to Alexander. He disconnected and sat in silence for a long moment, his hands flat on the desk, shoulders tight with tension that had nowhere to go. Then Elise made a small sound in her sleep, not quite a cry, just a whimper. Alexander stood immediately, crossing to the playpen. He lifted her carefully, adjusting her blanket, rocking her slightly until she settled back into deep sleep. He didn't put her back down. Instead, he returned to his desk and continued working one-handed, Elise sleeping against his shoulder, one of her small hands tangled in his tie. Kesha watched him and realized something that should have been impossible. Alexander Harrington needed Elise as much as she needed him. Maybe more. Whatever humanity he'd locked away after his sister's death, whatever capacity for softness he'd buried under years of corporate warfare and calculated cruelty, Elise had found it. Not through strategy or manipulation, but through simple, uncomplicated trust. She didn't know he was supposed to be a monster, so she treated him like he wasn't. And slowly, impossibly, he was starting to believe her. "Kesha," his voice was quiet, careful not to wake Elise. "Yes. Tomorrow I have meetings from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Cancel them." She looked up, startled. Alexander never canceled meetings. All of them. "All of them. I'm taking Elise to the pediatrician for her 1-year checkup, then to the park, then wherever else 1-year-olds go." He said it like he was planning a military operation. "You'll come with us. You're taking the day off to hang out with my daughter." "Our daughter?" He said it quietly, his eyes still on the sleeping baby in his arms. Then, as if realizing what he'd said, "I mean, she lives here, under my protection. That makes her my responsibility." It wasn't what he'd meant, and they both knew it. But Kesha didn't correct him. She just nodded and started canceling meetings while Alexander Harrington sat in his office, holding a baby like she was the most valuable thing in his empire, finally admitting what had been true since that first night. He wasn't letting them go. Not now, not ever. The first threat arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of an email. Kesha was sorting through Alexander's correspondence, the endless stream of meeting requests, acquisition proposals, and carefully worded intimidation from competitors, when she saw the subject line that made her breath catch. "We know about the girl." She opened it before her brain could warn her not to. "Mr. Harrington, your recent domestic acquisitions have not gone unnoticed. Such soft spots are liabilities in our business. We trust you'll remember this during Thursday's board vote regarding the Meridian merger. Regards, the collective." Kesha's hands were shaking when she forwarded it to Alexander. He was across the office, on the floor, helping Elise stack blocks into increasingly precarious towers. It was 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, and he'd cleared his morning schedule again, the third time this month. His phone chimed. He glanced at it, read the email, and his expression went completely blank. The blankness was worse than anger. Kesha had learned to read his moods over the past 3 months. Frustration showed in the tightness of his jaw. Irritation manifested as clipped words. Actual anger made his voice go cold and precise. But this blankness was something else. This was Alexander Harrington removing himself from emotion entirely, becoming the machine that had built his empire. "Take Elise to the apartment." His voice was perfectly calm. "Stay there until I come get you." "Alexander, what?" "Now, Kesha." She scooped up Elise, who protested leaving her blocks, and hurried to the guest wing. Behind her, she heard Alexander making phone calls, his voice dropping into registers of quiet menace that made her glad she wasn't on the receiving end. The collective wasn't a name she'd heard before, but the threat was clear enough. Someone had been watching Alexander, had noticed that the Iceman of Wall Street had developed an attachment, had identified Kesha and Elise as leverage. In Alexander's world, leverage was currency, and currency got spent. She'd known this job came with risks. Working for someone like Alexander meant existing in the crossfire of corporate warfare where the weapons were lawyers and money and carefully orchestrated destruction. But she'd thought, naively, she realized now, that the danger would stay abstract. Numbers on screens, companies dissolving, other people's problems. She hadn't thought they'd threaten her daughter. Alexander appeared in the apartment 4 hours later. He changed into dark jeans and a black sweater. She'd never seen him in casual clothes. It made him look younger and somehow more dangerous. "Pack bags for both of you. Enough for a week." "Where are we going?" "My private estate, upstate. It's secure." He was already moving through the apartment, his trained eye assessing, cataloging. "We leave in 30 minutes. "Alexander, you can't just run from." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes stopped her mid-sentence. "I'm not running. I'm removing you from the battlefield while I eliminate the threat. There's a difference. This is because of us, because you've been," she gestured helplessly, "spending time with Elise, being visible with us. They saw a weakness. They saw wrong." His voice was flat, absolute. "You and Elise aren't my weakness. You're my reason, and anyone who threatens you is going to learn the difference." The estate turned out to be a compound, 20 acres of wooded property 2 hours north of the city, surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security. The main house was smaller than the penthouse but somehow more personal, worn leather furniture, books stacked on tables, framed photographs Kesha didn't have time to examine. "This was my family's home," Alexander explained as he carried their bags inside. "I inherited it after my parents died. I haven't been here in 5 years." He showed them to a guest room, comfortable, lived in, with windows overlooking a garden that had gone wild with neglect. "Stay inside the house. The grounds are monitored, but I don't take chances." He was checking his phone constantly, messages streaming in. "I'll have security posted outside. If anything feels wrong, there's a panic button by the bed that connects directly to a response team. How long will we be here? As long as it takes. He looked at Elise, who was exploring the new room with delighted curiosity, pulling books off low shelves. I need to know you're safe while I work. What are you going to do? Alexander's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. I'm going to remind the collective why people call me the Iceman, and then I'm going to destroy them so thoroughly that no one will ever threaten what's mine again. He left that evening, and Kesha spent 3 days in the compound watching news reports about the sudden, catastrophic collapse of a major investment group called Collective Capital. It started with leaked emails exposing illegal trading practices, then evidence of fraud, then connections to organized crime. Within 72 hours, federal investigators had seized assets, arrested executives, and frozen accounts. The company that had threatened Alexander's family dissolved like salt in water. Kesha knew, watching the coverage, that this wasn't coincidence. This was Alexander Harrington conducting a symphony of destruction, every instrument perfectly tuned to maximum damage. When he returned on the 4th day, he looked exhausted but satisfied. It's done. The threat is eliminated. You destroyed an entire company in 3 days. I destroyed a criminal organization masquerading as a company. There's a difference. He crossed to where Elise was playing, crouching down to her level. She immediately reached for him, and he lifted her with the practiced ease that still surprised Kesha. They threatened her. That was their mistake. Alexander, Kesha didn't know how to finish the sentence. Thank you felt inadequate. This is insane felt accurate but unhelpful. I know what I am, Kesha. He said it quietly, his attention on Elise, who was playing with his watch. I know what I'm capable of. I've built my empire on calculated cruelty and strategic ruthlessness. I don't apologize for that. He looked up, meeting Kesha's eyes. But I also know what she is. What you both are. You're the only people in my life who see me as something other than a weapon or a threat. Elise doesn't flinch when I enter a room. You don't watch your words around me like everyone else does, and I will burn down anyone who tries to take that from me. It should have been frightening. Maybe it was. But it was also the most honest Alexander had ever been with her, and Kesha found herself stepping closer instead of backing away. We're not your property, Alexander. I know. He adjusted Elise on his hip, the gesture unconscious now. But you are my family. Whether you chose it or not, whether I deserve it or not, you're mine, and I protect what's mine. They returned to the penthouse the next day, and life resumed its new normal, if anything about their situation could be called normal. Alexander went back to his 18-hour days, but now he made sure to spend at least an hour on the floor with Elise, building block towers or reading board books in his deep voice while she listened with fascinated attention. Kesha had stopped questioning it, stopped trying to understand how a baby had cracked open a man everyone said was incapable of human connection. She just accepted it as the impossible, miraculous truth it was. Until the night everything went wrong. It happened fast, the way violence always does in the real world, without dramatic music or slow-motion clarity. Kesha was in Alexander's office at 11 p.m., both of them working late while Elise slept in her playpen. A hostile acquisition had turned personal. The CEO of the target company, a man named Marcus Voss, had started making threats. Not subtle corporate warfare, but actual physical intimidation. Alexander had laughed it off. Marcus is desperate. Desperate men make empty threats. Except they weren't empty. The explosion that took out the penthouse's main security panel was small, precisely placed. Just enough to create a 3-minute gap in the system. Just enough time for armed men to breach the private elevator. Alexander moved the instant the alarm started failing, his body responding with trained precision that spoke of preparation Kesha hadn't known about. He had Elise out of the playpen and in Kesha's arms before the first door burst open. Panic room, now. Code is your birthday backward. He was already moving between them and the entrance, reaching into a desk drawer for a gun Kesha hadn't known he kept. Alexander. G.O. She ran. The panic room was disguised as a closet, reinforced steel behind decorative wood. Her fingers shook as she entered the code, her birthday backward, because of course Alexander had memorized it. The door sealed with a hydraulic hiss, and Kesha held Elise tight, listening to the muffled sounds of violence from outside. Gunshots, shouts, the crash of furniture breaking. Then silence. Kesha waited in the darkness, Elise whimpering against her chest, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in, that Alexander was still alive. The silence stretched for eternity. Then a knock, 3 precise taps. "Kesha, it's me, you're safe." She opened the door to find Alexander standing in the wreckage of his office, blood streaking down one side of his face from a cut above his eye. The room looked like a war zone, overturned furniture, shattered glass, 2 unconscious men zip-tied near the elevator. "Are you hurt?" She was checking him for injuries before consciously deciding to move, one hand still holding Elise. "It's nothing, head wound, bleeds worse than it is." He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you okay? Is Elise?" We're fine, we're fine." She was shaking, adrenaline making her hands tremble. "What happened?" "Marcus sent contractors, thought he could intimidate me into backing off the acquisition." Alexander's smile was sharp and humorless. "He thought wrong." "Police arrived. Then federal agents. Apparently Marcus's contractors had outstanding warrants. Then Alexander's security team, looking grim and professional as they cataloged the breach and identified the failures that had allowed it to happen." Through it all, Alexander kept Kesha and Elise in his sight, his body positioned between them and every potential threat, even the police. It was 4 a.m. before everyone left, and they were alone again in the penthouse, surrounded by destruction. "I should take Elise to the apartment," Kesha said quietly. "Let you deal with this." "No," Alexander's voice was rough with exhaustion. "Stay." "Alexander. Please." The word came out like it hurt. I need to see that you're both okay. That this didn't." He stopped, his jaw tight, and Kesha realized with shock that his hands were shaking. Alexander Harrington, the Iceman, shaking. "Hey," she shifted Elise to one hip and reached out with her free hand, touching his arm. "We're okay. We're right here." He looked at her hand on his arm like it was the only real thing in the room. Then, slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them against his chest in an embrace that felt like desperation and relief combined. Elise, trapped between them, made a sound of sleepy protest, then settled, her small hand finding Alexander's shirt and fisting it with comfortable familiarity. "I almost lost you." Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. His face pressed into Kesha's hair. "Both of you, if they'd gotten through." "But they didn't, you stopped them." "This time, but there will be others, there are always others." He pulled back enough to look at her, his pale eyes raw with something Kesha had never seen there before, fear. "Being close to me puts you in danger, both of you, maybe you should." "Stop," Kesha said it firmly, surprising herself. "Don't you dare try to make this decision for us. We're not leaving." "Kesha, you think you're dangerous. You think your world is too dark for us." She shifted Elise, who was now fully awake and watching them with serious brown eyes. "Look at her, Alexander. Really look at her. She's not afraid of you. She's never been afraid of you, even when every instinct should have told her to run. Do you know why?" He shook his head, his expression breaking in ways Kesha had never seen. "Because she sees who you really are, not the Iceman, not the corporate raider, the man who holds her when she's scared, who reads her stories in that ridiculous deep voice, who canceled meetings to take her to the park because he decided she needed sunshine." Kesha's voice cracked. "That's who you are to her, to us, and we're not leaving that man because his enemies are stupid enough to threaten what's his." Alexander stared at her for a long moment. Then, impossibly, his eyes went wet. "I don't know how to keep you safe and keep you close." "Then we'll figure it out together." Kesha reached up and cupped his face, feeling the slight stubble, the tension in his jaw. "That's what families do." "Family?" He repeated the word like it was foreign, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Elise, apparently bored with the emotional moment, reached out and patted Alexander's cheek. "Da-da-da," she babbled, then giggled at her own sounds. Alexander's laugh was choked, almost painful. "Yeah, baby, I'm here." He took her from Kesha, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere." And standing in the wreckage of his office, surrounded by evidence of violence and danger, Alexander Harrington finally admitted what had been true since that first impossible night. He loved them, both of them, completely, and he would destroy anyone who tried to take them away. 6 months later, the penthouse had changed. Not dramatically. Alexander was still Alexander, exacting, intense, capable of corporate destruction with surgical precision. His empire had only grown larger, his reputation more fearsome. Competitors still trembled when his investment firm took an interest in their companies. But the apartment itself had transformed in small, telling ways. Elise's toys were scattered across the pristine floors. Bright plastic blocks mixed with sophisticated educational tools Alexander insisted were developmentally appropriate. The playpen in his office had been replaced by a proper child's workspace, a small table where Elise could draw while he handled calls, her crayon masterpieces taped to walls that had never held anything personal before. The kitchen, once showroom perfect and rarely used, now contained evidence of life. Elise's sippy cups, formula supplies, the organic baby food Alexander had sourced from 3 different specialty suppliers because he decided only the best was acceptable. Photos had appeared on surfaces throughout the apartment. Not professionally staged portraits but candid shots, Elise laughing, covered in pureed carrots. Alexander asleep on the couch with Elise sprawled across his chest. Kesha and Elise in the park, caught mid-smile by Alexander's surprisingly artistic eye. The most significant change wasn't visible at all. It was in the man himself. Alexander still worked brutal hours, but he'd stopped treating sleep as optional. He ate regular meals, usually with Kesha and Elise, and had started smiling at random moments when Elise did something clever or funny. The ice in his voice during business calls had developed a new edge, not cruelty but protective ferocity. People had started whispering that the Iceman was worse than before, more dangerous, and they were right. Just not in the way they thought. He was dangerous now because he had something to protect. And Alexander Harrington protecting what was his was a force of nature no amount of money could buy off. Kesha had moved out of the guest wing 3 months ago, not out of the penthouse, but into Alexander's bedroom. It had happened gradually, naturally, a series of late nights working that turned into conversations that turned into confessions that turned into kisses that felt inevitable. "I'm not good at this," Alexander had warned her that first night, his hands gentle despite the tension in his voice. Relationships, vulnerability, all the things normal people do easily. "Good thing I'm not looking for normal," Kesha had answered, and kissed him until his walls came down and the man beneath the ice finally let himself be seen. They still fought. Alexander was controlling by nature, used to getting his way through sheer force of will. Kesha had learned not to back down, to push back when he overstepped, to remind him that family meant partnership, not ownership. But they also loved fiercely, protecting each other with the same intensity Alexander brought to everything he did. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. On a Saturday morning in late spring, Alexander sat on the floor of the living room, building an elaborate block tower with Elise, who at 17 months was getting concerningly good at destruction. "No, sweetheart, we stack them." The tower toppled as Elise gleefully knocked it over, giggling at the crash. Alexander sighed with exaggerated patience. "You're going to be a terror when you're older, aren't you?" "Duh," Elise proclaimed proudly, then hugged his leg. Kesha watched from the kitchen, coffee in hand, her heart doing the painful sweet squeeze that happened whenever she saw them together. Alexander had never been supposed to be this person, gentle with children, patient with chaos, capable of love that wasn't transactional. But Elise had never gotten the memo about what Alexander was supposed to be, and in her refusal to see him as a monster, she'd given him permission to be something else. "Coffee's ready if you want some," Kesha called. Alexander looked up, and the smile he gave her was unguarded, the private smile she'd learned belonged only to her and Elise. "In a minute. I'm being structurally undermined by a toddler." "Seems like a fair fight." "She's winning." Later that morning, while Elise napped, Alexander found Kesha in his office, reviewing upcoming travel schedules. "I want to make this official," he said without preamble, because Alexander Harrington didn't believe in building up to important conversations. Kesha looked up from the tablet, Make what official? Us, you and me, Elise. He was standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I want to adopt her, legally. And I want, he paused, and Kesha realized with shock that he was nervous. I want to marry you, if you'll have me. The tablet slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the desk. Alexander, I know I'm not what you would have chosen. I know my world is dangerous and complicated and full of people who would use you to get to me. I know I'm controlling and difficult and better at destroying things than building them. He took a step into the room. But I love you, both of you. And I want the world to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and anyone who has a problem with that can come through me first. It was possibly the least romantic and most Alexander proposal possible, and Kesha loved it. You want to adopt Elise? I want her to have my name, my protection, legal proof that she's my daughter in every way that matters. His voice softened. She already calls me duh. I want it to be real. Kesha's eyes burned with tears. She loves you. God help us both, she loves you completely. And you, Alexander's voice was very quiet. Do you love me, even knowing what I am? Kesha stood, crossing to where he stood frozen in the doorway. She reached up and cupped his face, feeling the familiar line of his jaw, the slight tension that never quite left his shoulders. I love you because I know what you are, not despite it. You're ruthless and dangerous and absolutely terrifying when someone threatens what's yours. And you're also the man who canceled billion-dollar meetings to take a baby to the park, who reads bedtime stories in a voice that could negotiate hostile takeovers, who built an empire on ice but melted for a child who didn't know she was supposed to be afraid. She kissed him softly. So yes, Alexander Harrington, I'll marry you. And yes, you can adopt Elise, because you're already her father in every way that matters. Alexander's arms came around her with crushing force, his face buried in her hair. And Kesha felt the shudder that went through him, relief and joy and fear all combined. I won't let anything happen to either of you, he promised against her skin. Ever, whatever it takes. I know, and she did. Alexander's protection might be terrifying in its intensity, but it was also absolute. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. That's what family means. Family? He said it like a revelation, like he was finally understanding a language he'd been trying to learn for years. From the nursery, Elise's voice called out, Dada, Mama. They went to her together and found her standing in her crib, grinning with pride at her own cleverness. Alexander lifted her out, and she immediately wrapped her small arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder with the total trust that had started everything. Looking at them, her daughter and the man who'd become her daughter's father through sheer force of love, Kesha finally understood what had seemed impossible that first night. Alexander Harrington wasn't a monster learning to be human. He'd always been human, just wounded so badly he'd forgotten how. And Elise, in her infinite baby wisdom, had simply refused to believe the lie. She'd looked at the scariest man in New York and seen someone worth loving, worth trusting, worth calling Dada. And in doing so, she'd saved them all. 3 months later, they were married in a small ceremony at the upstate estate, just immediate staff and Alexander's lawyer as witnesses. Elise served as flower girl and spent the entire ceremony trying to eat the petals, much to Alexander's poorly concealed amusement. The adoption papers had come through 2 weeks earlier. Elise Marie Williams was now Elise Marie Harrington, and Alexander had cried when he'd signed the documents, actual tears streaming down his face while holding his daughter, both of them now legally bound by the love that had been real from the beginning. The press, when they found out about the wedding and adoption, went predictably insane. The Iceman of Wall Street, married to his former cleaning lady, adopting her daughter. It was the kind of fairy tale that shouldn't exist in the real world. Alexander handled it the way he handled everything, with surgical precision and zero tolerance for intrusion. One carefully worded press statement, one professional photo of the family, Kesha in her wedding dress, Alexander in his tuxedo, Elise between them with frosting on her face from the cake, and one very clear message that further invasion of their privacy would be met with legal action aggressive enough to bankrupt media companies. The press backed off. They always did when Alexander Harrington drew a line. Life settled into a new rhythm, or as settled as life could be when married to someone who ran a financial empire and made enemies as easily as breathing. There were still threats, still danger, still nights when Alexander came home tense and quiet, the weight of his world heavy on his shoulders. But now he had somewhere to come home to. People who loved him not for his money or power, but for the man he was when he let his guard down. For the father who built block towers and read board books. For the husband who kissed his wife like she was precious. For the man who'd been saved by a baby's unconditional trust. On Elise's second birthday, the penthouse was full of decorations, balloons and streamers that Alexander had insisted on hanging himself, determining that the party planning service he'd hired didn't understand the proper distribution ratio for optimal visual impact. Kesha had kissed him and told him he was being ridiculous. He'd kissed her back and continued adjusting balloon placement with engineering precision. Now, watching Elise destroy her birthday cake with enthusiastic joy, her face covered in frosting while Alexander recorded every moment with his phone, Kesha thought about how far they'd come from that first impossible night. A desperate mother bringing her baby to work. A cold billionaire who should have fired her on the spot. A baby who refused to believe that scary men couldn't be soft. It shouldn't have worked. By every logical measure, it should have ended in disaster. But Elise had never been logical. She'd just been love. Pure, uncomplicated, absolutely certain love. And Alexander, for all his ice and edges, had been desperate enough to believe her. "Mama, look." Elise held up a fistful of frosting-covered cake, beaming with pride. "I see, baby, that's beautiful." Alexander appeared beside Kesha, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "She's going to need a bath, possibly professional cleaning services. You're the one who said she should have the biggest cake possible." "I stand by that decision." He kissed Kesha's temple, his attention still on Elise, who was now attempting to share cake with her stuffed animals. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not running that first night. For staying, for seeing," he paused, his voice going rough, "for seeing that I could be more than what I was." Kesha turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd transformed from the Iceman into the warmth at the center of her world. "You were always more, Alexander. You just needed someone to remind you." "She reminds me every day." He was watching Elise, his expression soft in ways that still surprised Kesha even after a year of marriage. "Every time she smiles at me, every time she falls asleep on my chest, every time she calls me Dada, she reminds me that I'm not just the monster everyone thinks I am." "You're not a monster at all, you're just a man who loves his family." Kesha kissed him, soft and sure. "Our family." "Our family," Alexander agreed, and pulled them both close, his wife and his daughter, the two people who'd taken the fortress he'd built around his heart and turned it into a home. Outside, the Manhattan skyline glittered against the night sky. Millions of lives lived in those lights. Alexander's empire stretched across that city and beyond, built on ruthlessness and strategy and calculated destruction. But inside the penthouse, surrounded by birthday decorations and the laughter of a 2-year-old covered in cake, Alexander Harrington had found something his empire could never buy. Redemption through love. Salvation through trust. And a family that had started with a baby's cry and a billionaire's impossible mercy, and had become the one thing he'd never thought he could have: home. What would you have done in Kesha's shoes that first night? Would you have trusted a stranger, a billionaire with a reputation for ruthlessness, to hold your baby when everything inside you screamed to run? Or would you have seen what Elise saw, not a monster, but a man desperately in need of someone to believe in him? This story reminds us that sometimes the scariest-looking people are just the most wounded, that love doesn't always arrive the way we expect it to, that a child's pure, uncomplicated trust can heal scars that years of pain have created, and that families aren't always born. Sometimes they're built by desperate choices, impossible risks, and the courage to see past the walls people construct to protect themselves. If this story made your heart ache with hope, if it reminded you that redemption is possible even for the coldest of hearts, if it made you believe in second chances and unexpected families, then I need you to do something for me right now. Smash that like button if you believe love can transform even the most broken among us. Comment family below if this story touched your heart and tell me, have you ever been surprised by someone's hidden softness? Have you ever been the one hiding behind walls, waiting for someone brave enough to see past them? Share your story. This community is built on real experiences and real hope. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because I bring you stories like this every single week. Stories about justice, redemption, unexpected love, and the moments that change everything. Stories about people who refuse to give up on each other, even when the world says they should. We're building something special here, a community that believes in second chances, that celebrates love in all its messy, complicated, beautiful forms. Don't miss the next one. Your story might be next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who feels too broken to be loved, too damaged to deserve softness, too far gone for redemption, share this video with them. Let them see that Alexander found his way home. Let them know that Elise's unconditional trust changed everything. Let them believe that their story can have a different ending too. Because here's the truth they don't tell you. You're not too broken. You're not too damaged. You're not beyond saving. Sometimes you just need someone to look past the ice and see the human underneath. Sometimes you just need to be brave enough to let them. Drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe for more, and let's keep building this community together. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing. And thank you for sharing these stories with the people who need them most. See you in the next one.